Okay, well, welcome to today's presentation from the Research Medical Library on the use of generative AI tools in scientific writing. My name is Joe Munch. I'm a senior scientific editor in the RML, and with me today is Sarah Bronson.
Hi.
Yep, and we're just going to be going over some of the concepts of these tools and how they're used and how they probably shouldn't be used in writing for scientific publications. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. That's usually the best way to do it because it's a little less disruptive and frankly, they're easier um, to understand because not everybody's audio is great. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we've been using some tools with AI components for quite some time to assist us with our writing. Um, Everybody knows about spell checkers. Everybody knows about grammar checkers. Um, those of you who are old enough probably remember this guy. I think his name was Clippy, and probably the most obnoxious tool with any kind of AI component. So these tools all use traditional AI, and like I said, we've been using them for quite some time. So these traditional AI tools use predefined rules to recognize patterns and make suggestions. So you can think of a spell checker that flags a misspelled word in your Word document and offers some correctly spelled alternatives, right? That's the most basic way to think of traditional AI, to my mind. And importantly, these tools do not create new content. Now, we've moved on from these tools at light speed, really, in the past couple of years to what's called generative AI. And generative AI goes above and beyond traditional AI because generative AI, rather than just using rules to check your information, use their training on these vast amounts of data to actually provide you with, for lack of a better term, new information. Um, and there's a multitude of implications here, but the biggest one we're concerned with right now is that traditional AI, the spell checkers, the things we've been using for years, those don't create new content. But the generative AI tools, right there in the name, they do. They generate new content. And I am by no means an AI expert, and I've been trying so hard to think of how to best kind of describe this if I were having a conversation with somebody, which I am now. But the best analogy that I can come up with, and you already see it there, is that with traditional AI, it's like you're presenting it with a homemade hamburger, something you've made yourself, and you're asking this AI program to tell you if what you've given it, if what you've given is in fact a hamburger. And it runs it up against these rules that it has, and it says, well, yes, it looks like a hamburger, or it might even go as far to say that, well, it's a hamburger, but it needs onions or it needs mustard or it needs ketchup or something like that. So again, just checking your work for you, right? Um, but with generative AI, what you're doing is you're actually asking the program to make you the hamburger. And in this case, it uses everything that it's learned about hamburgers, both the good and the bad, to give you what it thinks is the closest approximation of what you want. And that depends on how you ask it. Okay. Um, so you may say, you know, ChatGPT, give me a hamburger, and you might in fact come up with, I think it's Play-Doh. so So this is going to be kind of a thread that we're talking about through this presentation is that you really have to be careful with these generative AI tools because although they appear to be um, very knowledgeable, in fact, upon closer inspection, that's not always the case. And today we're concerned with this use of AI in writing tools because, of course, there's generative AI for all kinds of applications. The next nearest example is probably the image generators. You know, you say, I want a picture of a cat on a unicorn fighting a dragon, and generative AI gives you something like that. Okay, but today we're concerned with AI writing tools. Um, so as I kind of mentioned, with traditional AI writing tools, you give the text itself, you give it, the tool the text you write, you give it the stuff that you make, and they make suggestions. They use algorithms to analyze the text rather than create it, because those algorithms were, written by programmers, and they put the rules in. The program. These are the rules you must follow to check this writing. And some of these tools you've probably heard of. There's Grammarly, and the Microsoft Editor, Ginger. There's just a wide assembly of these tools, tons of them now. And even some of these, what I call traditional AI writing tools, are now using generative AI. So Grammarly has a version called Grammarly Go. So generative AI is making inroads into even these more traditional AI kinds of writing tools. Okay, so with generative AI writing tools, you ask them to generate the text for you. And they draw on everything they were trained on, good and bad, to generate that text. And so what they give you depends on what you ask it. And here are some of those examples, the most famous being ChatGPT, which was introduced, the, the, the revolutionary version, I guess, was introduced only in November of last year. And you can tell how far we've come just since then. But of course, there's Jasper, Bing, which I think uses a version of ChatGPT, Write, and Bard, and again, a whole plethora of others as well. So these tools are out there. The question is, should you use them for your scientific writing projects? And if so, how should you use them? So I've made this distinction between traditional AI and generative AI because it's an important one. Journals are concerned with generative AI, not so much traditional AI. No journal is going to ask you to disclose the use of a spell checker on a manuscript, but they want to know if the text that is in your manuscript is in fact written by you or generated by an AI tool. And so we're going to concentrate on the most famous, ChatGPT, um, and well, let's just move on. So let's talk about what the journals say. In general, there's agreement on these 3 points, and that's first that AI cannot be an author, and that's because authorship has specific criteria that must be met, and AI cannot meet those criteria. If AI is used in writing a manuscript, that use must be disclosed. And finally, authors are responsible for any AI-generated content, because again, this aligns with the authorship criteria that authors must be able to take responsibility for what is in the manuscript. AI can't do those things yet. Now, there are some exceptions. The first one being science. It's been the exception since practically day one. They've basically said that for their journals, and there's several of them, but for the science journals, the word original is enough to signal that text written by ChatGPT is not acceptable. This from an editorial written from H.H. Thorpe back in, I think it was actually like a day or two after ChatGPT came out. But basically, science says no generative AI for writing our articles. And if you do use generative AI, you're in trouble. I only now recently discovered that AACR also has a recommendation against using generative AI to produce new text, images, and so forth. So there's more of these exceptions out there. These are 2 of the big ones I've noticed. So you always have to be careful when submitting to a journal to make sure that you're in fact allowed to use generative AI. So how do you disclose that use? Because generative AI isn't going away, and because scientific journals are going to have to address this one way or the other, there needs to be some disclosure, because they all agree on this point more or less. Now, this disclosure needs to include the AI tool used, so that could be ChatGPT, it could be any number of other tools. It needs to include the version number, the date accessed, the manufacturer creator name, and along with a description of how it was used for which parts of the manuscript. Okay, so that could be generative AI for images and text, or generative AI for a data analysis. It just depends. So for those uses of generative AI that are actually part of the study, it should be commonsensical that that description would appear in the methods section. So these would be tools for a data analysis, data visualization, image generation, those kinds of things. But if you're using generative AI to actually write the paper, that usually appears in the acknowledgments. And there's a small proviso here, and that is that there is also this emerging idea that no, actually, because acknowledgments is a place where you acknowledge actual people, generative AI programs cannot be acknowledged there either. So you really need to visit those journal instructions to figure out where it should be disclosed. The most straightforward disclosure is in an explicit declaration, and this depends on the journal. So much like you would have a conflict of interest declaration, disclosing any potential conflicts of interest that might influence the study or an interpretation of its findings or what have you, there would be an explicit declaration of whether generative AI was used to write the paper. And that might look like this. This one's from Elsevier. And you can see that they've kind of left some blanks here. During the preparation of this work, the authors used, say, ChatGPT in order to, it might be edit the text, revise the text, whatever. And then importantly, after using this tool, the authors reviewed and edited the content as needed and take full responsibility for the content of the publication. And I think that's where journals in general are going to land with this use of generative AI. And I think if you do turn to generative AI, a statement like this should appear somewhere in your manuscript. Now, all that being said, MD Anderson has its own guidelines for using generative AI in scientific writing and beyond. So these guidelines can be applied to what we're talking about today. First and foremost is that you must safeguard, as you would in any circumstance, personally identifiable information and PHI. Because tools like ChatGPT take whatever information you give it and retain it to further train that tool to kind of refine that tool's ability to produce text, it will keep PHI. So there's a potential that whatever you put into that tool is going to be out there for somebody else to see. So don't put PHI, personally identifiable information, or intellectual property information into these kinds of tools. These technologies should be used with discretion. And in other words, you need to be careful and you need to be in compliance with institutional policies when using these tools. You need to be critical of the output. Again, going hand in hand with this recommendation that the authors must be responsible for what's in the manuscript. The information that these tools put out is not 100% reliable. And that means that it needs to be checked, rechecked, confirmed. Any information needs to be carefully reviewed. This one kind of beyond our scope today, but MD Anderson has purchasing policies for virtually everything. Just be sure that you're compliant with any purchasing policies. So if you're going to go purchase the advanced version ChatGPT for use at work, make sure you're in compliance. And again, disclose your use and accept accountability for what this tool has created for you. And you see the tagline there. These guidelines in detail are provided on the MD Anderson SharePoint site. The link is in the chat. Thanks, Sarah. And with that, I am going to hand off to Sarah, and she's going to talk about some of the potential uses in scientific writing.
All right. I think that should be me all set up. Looks like it's visible. All right. So now that we've defined these terms and set some boundaries and laid some notes of caution. Let's talk about, well, what can we do, and what are the benefits that we do have to admit that are some use cases where this actually can apply to our work in the scientific writing process. And we'll start with things like brainstorming or outlining, or at least getting started on an outline. Now, the structure of your paper ultimately should be tailored to the specific goals that you're working with, but an AI-suggested outline can be helpful for reminding you of topics or subtopics that you might have forgotten, and showing you just what's may have been covered before by similar papers, just a source of additional ideas and connections. Now, here I use the phrasing rudimentary drafting because I wouldn't just say use it to write a draft. But I liked the way another presenter put it in the How to Train Your Robot training, which is that AI could give you your draft 0, which is not your first draft, but something more preliminary to that, kind of more of a jumping off point, or kind of a nucleus of material you can start building around. This is, you could think of it as a great way to get over that blank page hurdle where you don't even know where to begin, and just have something to start working on and reshaping, like you're working with a piece of clay. And actually, a friend suggested to me that if you're really stuck and you don't think that you're going to get something good if you ask AI, it's going to give you all the wrong answers, you could ask AI to write something for you anyway, and then when you see how wrong it is, harness your urge to correct it until you actually get a little bit of momentum. But so yeah, basically getting past that dreaded writer's block and getting started with your first line. Also, drafting boilerplate, and by that I mean passages that can be written in an extremely rote manner because they are always in line with certain conventions and don't need a lot of personalization. And that could include maybe a very commonly performed basic science method, which you would, of course, vet and correct any missed details on, or possibly that paragraph you always see in a retrospective study talking about the inherent limitations of this design. That could be one use. AI also has some potential utility in summarizing as well as paraphrasing. And we will look at some examples of most of these things, and see what it gets right and what might still need the human adjustment. Generative AI also can be helpful for improving things like grammar, fluency, style, those little things that on a line-by-line level can make your writing flow better. And this does still need to be vetted by a person because there may be new meaning introduced you don't intend, but it is a source of options if you're stuck on an awkward phrasing. And AI can be used in some cases to improve concision and shorten, for example, abstracts. And there are, of course, a variety of specialized tools that are geared for specific things like paraphrasing, and we haven't vetted them all, but just to say that some tools that use this technology may perform better than others depending on what they are designed for.
And Sarah, I'm going to break in, and we have a question or two in the chat.
Okay.
The first is, do we need to disclose if we use the potential uses listed here? Right. So as Sarah mentioned, you can go beyond using ChatGPT to simply refine your writing or to provide a draft of your ideas. And when you're talking about, I, I presume you're talking about things like outlining, brainstorming, those kinds of things. And the short answer is yes. If you're using generative AI to, you know, brainstorm your study, design your study, um, try to outline a rough draft of your paper, yes, that use should be disclosed. Um, Another question, how can I use ChatGPT through MD Anderson? Do I need a separate account? I don't have a good answer for that. Uh, the account that I use is personal. Um, and I've used it only to kind of see what its abilities and limitations are. Oh, and follow-up is actually the question is checking grammar and style, should that be disclosed? Well, that's a good question. That's because that kind of hits that gray line, because if you're using generative AI to check grammar and style versus traditional AI where you're using something like Grammarly or just, Word spell checker, you wouldn't disclose the use of spell checker, but you might disclose the use of ChatGPT. I mean, to be on the safe side, you might just acknowledge ChatGPT as you would, say, an editor who proofreads your paper, and that's probably the safest way to go.
Yes, if you're not sure, I would go ahead and disclose it. If I, I agree that there is a gray area between, well, did I use this just to in the more for the more traditional uses, or did I use it to actually create something? And that can start to be a fine line depending on how heavily it's rewriting. So yeah, I would go ahead and disclose, and you can probably specify how it was that you used it, just to give the journal editor and your readers that proper context. So I think it is different if you are using it to to spit out chunks of draft versus refine an awkward phrasing. And so you could say something like, it was used to improve fluency of some sentences. But yes, and also I would just as always look at the specific journal instructions. There may be nuances in the way that they prefer you to handle it. All right. Well, thanks. Yeah, I didn't realize that the questions were not popping up for me. So yes, please feel free to interrupt me when those come up. Um, so yeah, those are kind of the 8 or so potential uses where we kind of saw the most promise for actually using AI in scientific writing. And now we'll go on to some of the limitations that we have noticed in grappling with this from our perspective as scientific editors. So as we know, it can be inaccurate and it has limited knowledge as acknowledged in its own words. Now, specifically, the generative AI like ChatGPT and Bard can hallucinate false information. And I think it's especially notable how poorly it can perform on providing references. If it is asked, it sometimes will make up references, sometimes will provide plausible and even true existing references, but then the claims that are made in the sentence you seek to support and what the reference is actually about may be just the most tenuous of connection, if any. Now, not that humans don't do that too, but AI certainly performs worse on that account. Although I have heard of a few specialized AI-powered tools that are supposed to be able to help you find relevant references. I cannot speak to those, though. And as you have heard, it can reproduce the biases of the material it was trained on. It can potentially plagiarize ideas from others and can take your ideas. As Joe said, it can retain confidential information that you've provided it with, and we don't really know where it goes after that. And we have quite a few other concerns. Basically, it lacks abilities that remain unique to humans because it is not a mind. It is very easy for us to be lulled into conversing with it as our very convenient robot butler, and it does put on that appearance. But like its predecessors, it is ultimately a pattern imitator. It does not go through the same logical steps that that a person would in order to put together an answer. It doesn't have an interior model of how the world works and the state of reality against it, which checks anything. It can check anything. It does not reason. I really enjoyed the way that the writer Ted Chiang put it in the title of his New Yorker piece. ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web, and not a PNG, a JPEG, because it's kind of just a blurred out average of everything that is input into it. So I've noticed that if you simply ask it a fairly straightforward question, can you format this text for this journal? It cannot. If you haven't told it specifically what to do, it cannot go look up the web page, find out what the word count should be, look at what the reference style should be, look at what terminology is preferred. And another interesting case where I think that some may be more credulous than I on this is questions like, well, what should I use for my study design? What statistical test should I run? And I think that can be a very a difficult thing to deal with because it can give you great suggestions at times, but it simply cannot be relied on in the same way as a person, and what it spits out to you nevertheless must be run by a human who is an expert in what you're looking for. Just as an example, if you ask it, here is what I am studying, I want to compare these groups, what type of test should I use? And if you haven't known to ask it to look at parametric versus non-parametric distribution of data, then it might or might not account for that in the way that a person would, just as an example. So it is a source of ideas. It just ultimately cannot be the authority. So that was the longest bullet point ever. AI also just can't extrapolate from incomplete information when talking about something that's fundamentally unique. And I think that we have all recognized this more as we have experimented with this. If you kind of give it the cliff notes of your original research study that you just did, it's not going to spit out a draft that you can work with unless you really go kind of small section by section, piece by piece. So it's not impossible to write your paper by telling AI what to put in it, but you should really expect the process to be a very collaborative back and forth thing, not something where you give it something and it gives you back what you need in one fell swoop. Another thing, a person is needed to recognize where writing falls short or is not effective in doing the job you're ultimately trying to accomplish. It cannot tell you, well, is this really convincing enough? It can't tell you, will this resonate with the reader I am writing for, or especially the journal editor and reviewers you want to impress. And my final point is that there's a fundamental unoriginality to generative AI text because the way it is made is, as we know, trying to imitate and really blend in with the body of human written work that already exists. So it takes specifics, it averages them out, it speaks in generalities that are all based on things that already exist. Yet, in many situations for academic authors, you're looking for the total opposite. And you are trying to is in the word original research. How often has someone written a review article only to have it kicked back with reviewers telling you, this is all old stuff. This was covered by such and so and so, so and so already. When we're really looking for a new perspective, we have new things happening. We need new analysis. And as for research, the purpose is always to test an untested idea or to fill, as we say, to target a gap in knowledge that has not yet been filled. And as for grants, there is an entire section about demonstrating the innovation of what you propose. So finding those new solutions, articulating those original points of view, they are what really make the scientific literature richer, and those still remain human actions so far. So now we'll dig into some examples we tried out. Here's an example of just generating what I called boilerplate text. If you're writing something other authors have done 1,000 times, then you may be able to come up with something helpful that is at least a source of ideas. Now, this section could be great of reminding you of, well, here's some potential problems in my retrospective study that I might want to highlight. You probably wouldn't spend this much text on that one paragraph, but it is not a bad overview. And it's I think part of what makes it strong is that this is such a common blurb to use that it gets to be very well trained. So there's one example. Like another one that I had to do recently was I had to like write a contract. I have never written a contract, and so it can give you ideas for that. But that's beyond scientific writing. And now here is maybe more of the pre-drafting idea generating stage. Let's say you're writing a review article and you need some background on the benefits of, a lot of us are familiar with this, tobacco cessation after a cancer diagnosis. So here's what it gives us for that. And as we've said, this is not something you'd want to plug in as is. You don't know right away whether it's fully accurate, and it's probably not an exact fit for what you need anyway. Maybe you have a different focus, or it's too broad, it's too long. Maybe not all of this is relevant, but it can remind you again of points you would like to tie in, which you then should be sure to confirm are accurate and support with reliable sources. And as we said, ChatGPT and other generative AI currently don't perform well at all when providing references that are not only accurate, but relevant. And I've noticed that they've started adding a disclaimer when you ask it for references, which is, I'm glad that it does. And here I've shown the first 5 out of a list of 7 bullet points that I was given, just included this to fit it on the page in response to the same prompt as before. And basically, the long and short of it is that a lot of these references can be traced back to actual articles. Sometimes the volume number or the year is wrong. Sometimes the authors are wrong. The titles are right, but not a one of these is actually supportive of the claim that it is purportedly supporting. Like the first reference, it's a real title, wrong authors, wrong numbers, but rather than telling us how tobacco cessation can improve treatment outcomes, improve effectiveness of cancer treatments. It's more a very, very broad policy recommendation document about harms of tobacco. So maybe it popped up because it gets cited a lot and it's got a lot of great info, but it's just an absolute misfit for this sentence. And it's and same for pretty much all of the others. It's just the scope of the studies or the texts that are cited. It makes there are some keywords shared between the two, and in some cases that's really it. As for editing existing text to address issues with writing, there are mixed results. Now, admittedly, ChatGPT can be a serviceable grammar editor. Occasional mistakes, but it can make text sound more fluent, and it makes some good suggestions for reducing word count. And here's some experiments for clarity and readability. Sometimes I have found that it can indeed help clarify text that seems clunky, but other times, in my opinion, it is kind of a wash. Here I've tried feeding it a sentence from the literature that I found to be somewhat awkward. So let's just read it out. Dysphagia, i.e. swallowing problems, is a symptom or a collection of symptoms of underlying anatomical abnormalities or impairments and disorders in cognitive acts involved in the transport of mainly food and drink from the mouth to the stomach. So it's made it more readable, partly by making some of the word choice a little less technical. It's a little smoother. But I still wouldn't just take this because it has separated it into two sentences. And in my opinion, the first sentence, truncated as it is now quite vague and seems incomplete as a description of what dysphagia is. And I also tried prompting it to simply edit the sentence. It's not always the case that the person trying to get ChatGPT's help knows exactly what the issue is. And I found the results to be similar. There's some things that I might take, but there's also some things that I would not keep. And an example, just a kind of really specific issue I had with this as an editor was the way that the phrase, the movement of food and liquids primarily from the oral cavity to the stomach was written. They've basically moved that concept of primarily or mainly to describe from describing food and drink to describing the route that the food and drink take, which is a change in meaning that is just inappropriate here. So basically, these responses are offering suggestions that could help. You just might have to kind of pick out what you prefer or what serves you from among what does not serve you. And we've also found some halfway decent results for abstract shortening, and especially if you tell it how much you'd like to shorten it. So in this case, I just told it, cut it by 15%. And I actually liked a lot of these. For example, in the yellow, towards the end, the absence, in the original, it says the absence of these genomic events. And then that 5 or 6 word phrase is just translated to this genetic simplicity. Well, I think that's great. So here I would certainly use a lot of this, but of course I would go line by line, word by word, and make sure of it. All right, and With that, we'll send it back to Joe for his examples.
Okay. Just give me half a second to find the correct screen. Okay, so you should see another example here. I hope everybody can see that. Paraphrase this passage. So as Sarah mentioned, other potential uses here for ChatGPT include summarizing, paraphrasing, and summarizing and paraphrasing are important tools in scientific writing because they enable authors to communicate ideas from others, and they allow them to communicate those ideas without plagiarizing them, so without just copying and pasting. So that's kind of essential to original scientific writing. These are also two tools that many writers find difficulty mastering. So let's go ahead and look at paraphrasing first. I asked ChatGPT to paraphrase this passage, and I'll spare you the details, but it is from a published article available online, so I inputted absolutely nothing that wasn't already out there. And the paraphrase it returned was halfway decent. Remember that paraphrase is a retelling in distinctly different wording of another paragraph, passage, or sentence that retains the key detailed information of the original and is generally about the same length of the original. And this paraphrase does a fairly reasonable job of that. So the important message here is that the data in the paraphrase passage match those in the original. You can see this in the highlighted text. The numbers are all the same. Those are the important details that you want a paraphrase to retain. But this highlighting also reveals something else, and this is what I would call kind of a limitation of the paraphrase. If anybody can point out what that is in the chat or just shout it out, I'd appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll just tell you. All right, I'm going to go just tell you. So you'll notice that the highlighted information appears in the same order. So just at a glance, there's probably some text in the paraphrase that tracks a little too closely to the original passage. And so I would say that this paraphrase needs some additional reworking to kind of make sure it's more distinct from the original. That, and of course, it would need a thorough review for the content, whether it's accurate. You could use a similar approach to summarize information. So using the same passage, I asked it to summarize it, remembering that a summary is a concise account of the main points of a longer passage. And here's what I got. I would say that this is not a great summary. And here's why. I'll give it that it's certainly shorter than the original, and a summary in general is shorter than the original passage. But that's because ChatGPT just went through and simply trimmed some of the information from each sentence. And you can see that the grayed out information in the original passage no longer appears in the final passage. More importantly, a summary is supposed to give kind of that big picture message, right, of the original passage. That's not done here. What we get is an example that retains too much of the granular detail of the original. And I'd call this a mediocre paraphrase at best. You might expect for a passage this long a 1 or 2 sentence summary. And here ChatGPT gave me 4. But you'll also recall that what ChatGPT gives you depends an awful lot on what you give it. So if you ask it to summarize the same passage in just 1 or 2 sentences, you get a much more trimmer version of a summary. But even so, these sentences give only the aim and a partial account of the findings. If anybody can tell me what's missing here, please do so. This goes back to something that Sarah said in the concerns and limitations about it not really understanding. what you're asking it and it not really being able to meet the criteria that you have in your mind about what that text needs to do. So the thing that's missing here is the question that any reader is going to have, which is namely, if this is a summary, in this case, of pembrolizumab and radiation therapy, they want to know, is that therapy, was it effective in this study? And that is a judgment that ChatGPT can't give you. And it's not one that appears in the summary. So I would expect a summary if I'm reading a human author's paper. I'm expecting a summary that explains to me, yes, the study found that it was moderately effective, somewhat effective, some sort of judgment on whether that treatment had any merit. And you don't get that from ChatGPT. You get some truncated version of what you gave it. So all that being said, here are some, what I think are some pretty common sense recommendations for using generative AI. The first and foremost is that you should use these writing tools with an abundance of caution and supervision. And that means you never share personal information, PHI, or intellectual property information with it. And you always carefully review any generated content for accuracy and you revise it if necessary. So going back to that whole hamburger analogy, you can ask generative AI tools to give you a hamburger, but unless you know what a good hamburger looks like, tastes like, is supposed to be, you may not get a good hamburger. You may not be any the wiser for it. In other words, you need expertise to use these tools. You can't rely on these tools to give you that expertise. Always check the target journal to determine, one, whether AI generated text is allowed, and two, if it is allowed, how it should be disclosed in your manuscript. And finally, because there is a potential for plagiarism with ChatGPT, not only because it's trained on things that are already out there on the internet, but also because the way it responds to similar queries can be so very similar itself. If you and another author halfway across the globe ask it similar questions, you're going to get similar responses. If both those responses turn up in two papers, there's your plagiarism. So use a tool like Authenticate before submitting it to the journal to identify potential plagiarism and revise. Okay, and so while we're fielding any additional questions, and of course, Sarah, if you have anything to add, please do so. Here's the Research Medical Library contact information. I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing that there is a question. Does MDA allow us to use ChatGPT in our work computers? And if you go and look at the recommendations that we pointed out earlier, and I'm afraid I don't have them directly in front of me, but the recommendation, there is something specific about ChatGPT and it is a little muddy as to whether it's allowed or not. And so I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer there. Again, look at those recommendations and I guess take your own interpretation of it because I wasn't able to get a clear idea of what they want either.
Joe?
Yes.
I have a question. This is Erwin. Um, this is something I haven't had a chance yet to look into for myself, but maybe you and Sarah uncovered something in your research for this presentation. Are publishers using AI detection tools? And if so, do we know how they're using them or how a report from a tool like that would factor into like the evaluation process?
Speaking for myself, I have come across some of that information. First, I will say that there are tools out there for detecting generative AI generated text. Compared with a tool like Authenticate, which takes what you give it, you put your manuscript into Authenticate, and it compares the text of that manuscript to a whole library of existing published stuff on the internet. and then gives you a report saying, whether text in your manuscript has been spotted elsewhere on the internet. Chat, the tools that are used to check for generative AI text, to my understanding, don't work that way, and so they're not as reliable. It's like my understanding is that they look for certain characteristics of what's considered generative AI text, except those characteristics are often shared with just plain old writers. And so it doesn't have a high degree of specificity or what's the other one? It's not as accurate as, say, Authenticate is in, identifying text. It can only kind of give almost like a confidence interval of whether it's been created using generative AI. I believe that the mode for journals is that they're going to start incorporating these tools despite their shortcomings. But again, because these tools can't, when you use Authenticate will actually point to the place where the text appears previously. So you have that hard information saying that this text appears in this previous publication. But with the generative AI checking tools, all you can have is kind of this, we're moderately confident that this might be generative AI text. So those tools seem kind of behind the curve on what ChatGPT and other tools can do compared with Authenticate. And that's why we say use Authenticate, because that'll at least identify those the potential plagiarism instances.
I don't know whether publishers or journals are trying to detect AI using any of these tools, but I know that the Scholarly Kitchen last month admonished them not to do that. They don't work, but that doesn't mean someone's not trying to do it.
Yeah, good catch.
Let's see, we have a question. I know a little about how to effectively converse with ChatGPT. To improve on the answer I get, would you please suggest materials that improve my effectiveness? I don't know offhand of a resource that is a guide for that. I wish I had a recording of how to train your robot, which Mary Sizemore and I believe Bradley, I don't remember his last name, put on a few weeks ago. But it really is a lot of trial and error. Oftentimes I put my input doesn't give me back what I want, and so I just keep on trying until I find what it wants to hear for me to get what I want. But do you have any suggestions for that, Joe?
I don't, except to say you could probably Google this and probably get all kinds of information. It's a chat bot, right? And so you're having a conversation, it retains the information you give it, and then as you ask it to refine that information, it does so. And so it's just the more parameters you put in, if you're talking about, well, whether it's, and I wouldn't recommend this, we say that it can be used to reduce the word count of an abstract, but if that abstract has data that you don't want to be shared, you have to do what? I guess just kind of put X's and O's where that data are going to appear. But you can say, reduce this abstract by X number of words. Okay, reduce it by X number of words, but also give it, headings, or reduce by X number of words, give it heading. The more parameters that you put in there, ChatGPT does do an okay job of responding to those parameters. But again, at the end of it, you need to know whether what it's giving you is what you want and what is correct. And that's aside from putting PHI and other proprietary information into ChatGPT, which is the biggest no-no here, the other one is that don't just accept what it gives you at face value, because it's often it's unreliable. Is Authenticate free? MD Anderson does have an account, and you can get it through the Research Medical Library, and I think it's RML-Help at MD Anderson. You can request that. I hope I spelled that right. And of course, thank you, Erwin. When you send a manuscript to editing services in the Research Medical Library as a service to our authors, we run each and every manuscript we receive through Authenticate. So if there is any potentially problematic text, we can alert you to it. And so it's there and it's available, no problem. Okay. Okay, if there's any other questions, please feel free to post them. I'll stop recording. It's just about 2 o'clock on the dot, so I believe we've actually gone over our time, but I will hang around for a few moments in case anybody has a question that they don't want put down for posterity, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. Happy writing.